Brendan Montgomery let out a frustrated breath as he jiggled the doorknob again. Nothing. The keypad on the Airbnb door blinked red, rejecting the passcode for the third time. He ran a hand through his thick, dark hair, his patience wearing thin. This was supposed to be a quiet weekend away from the chaos of his multi-million-dollar real estate empire, just a few days in a small coastal town to clear his head. Instead, he was locked out of his own rental, standing in the chilly evening air with nothing but his overnight bag and a phone with no signal. "Great," he muttered under his breath. "Locked out." A warm, feminine voice called from behind him. Brendan turned, his sharp blue eyes landing on a woman standing a few feet away on the cobblestone sidewalk. She was wrapped in a thick sweater, her auburn hair caught up in a messy bun, and she held a paper bag filled with what looked like groceries. Her brown eyes were kind, but filled with curiosity. "Yeah," he admitted, exhaling. "The passcode isn't working and I can't get in touch with the host." She shifted the bag in her arms and stepped closer. "That's the Johnson place, right? Their keypad's been acting up for weeks. You're probably locked out for good unless you reset it from the inside." Brendan let out a dry chuckle. "That's helpful. Any chance you have a magic key?" She grinned. "No magic key, but I do have a couch. If you need a place to crash, I live just down the street." Brendan hesitated. He wasn't the kind of man who accepted help easily. He was used to solving problems himself, always in control. But right now, he had no other options, and something about her felt safe. "You don't even know me," he pointed out. She shrugged. "You don't look like a serial killer." A slow smile tugged at his lips. "That's reassuring." "Come on," she said, nodding toward the street. "I'm Ophelia and you, Brendan." "Nice to meet you, Brendan. Now, let's get you inside before you freeze to death." He followed her down the quiet street, past charming brick buildings and glowing street lamps. The town had a cozy, old-world feel, nothing like the sleek, high-rise world he was used to. Ophelia's place was small but welcoming. Bookshelves lined the walls, and the scent of vanilla and cinnamon filled the air. She set her groceries down and turned toward him. "Make yourself at home." "Thanks," he said, glancing around. "I owe you one." "Well, if you really want to repay me, you can help me cook dinner," she teased. Brendan blinked. "You're letting a stranger help you cook," she laughed. "You don't look like a serial killer, remember?" For the first time in a long time, Brendan relaxed. Maybe this weekend wouldn't be so bad after all. Brendan rolled up his sleeves, eyeing the assortment of ingredients Ophelia had pulled from her grocery bag. Fresh produce, spices, and a loaf of rustic bread sat on the counter, the kitchen warm and inviting. He wasn't used to being in kitchens. His meals were usually prepared by private chefs or delivered from high-end restaurants. But something about this moment, standing beside Ophelia in a quiet little town, felt different. "Can you chop these?" she asked, handing him a bundle of carrots and a knife. He took the knife, testing its weight in his hand. "I think I can manage that." Ophelia glanced at him with an amused expression. "You don't strike me as someone who spends much time cooking." Brendan let out a low chuckle. "That obvious. Just a little." She leaned against the counter, watching him attempt to chop the carrots with precise, careful movements. "You're holding the knife like it's a weapon." He paused, setting the knife down with a small shake of his head. "I'm used to handling numbers, not vegetables." She laughed, the sound light and easy. "Well, lucky for you, I'm an excellent teacher." Brendan found himself enjoying the way she moved around the kitchen, effortlessly preparing ingredients, humming softly under her breath. There was a simplicity to it, a rhythm he wasn't used to in his fast-paced world. "So, what brings you to our little town?" she asked, stirring a pot on the stove. "Needed a break," he admitted, leaning against the counter. "Work's been demanding." Ophelia arched an eyebrow. "Let me guess, something corporate, real estate." She tilted her head, considering him. "That explains the tailored coat and expensive watch." Brendan glanced down at his wrist before shifting his attention back to her. "And what about you? What do you do when you're not rescuing stranded strangers?" she smiled, tossing herbs into the simmering pot. I run the bookstore down the street. It's been in my family for generations. A bookstore? He hadn't expected that. Surprised. Not exactly, it suits you. Her eyes flickered with curiosity. How so? He gestured around the cozy kitchen, the shelves lined with well-loved cookbooks, the faint scent of ink and paper lingering in the air. You seem like someone who appreciates stories. Someone who values things that last. She studied him for a moment before turning back to the stove. That's surprisingly insightful. Brendan wasn't sure why, but her approval felt like something he wanted to earn. As the meal came together, the conversation flowed easily. He learned she had grown up in this town, that she had taken over the bookstore after her father passed, and that she had a penchant for collecting rare editions of classic novels. In return, he shared bits and pieces about his upbringing, how he had built his company from the ground up, and how, despite all his success, he sometimes felt like he was constantly chasing something he couldn't quite define. By the time they sat down to eat, the evening had slipped into a comfortable quiet. The food was simple but rich with flavor, far better than any five-star meal he had eaten in recent memory. "You're thinking about something," Ophelia observed, taking a sip of her drink. Brendan set his fork down, meeting her gaze. "Just realizing I can't remember the last time I sat down and actually enjoyed a meal like this." Her expression softened. "Maybe you should do it more often," he exhaled, a slow, measured breath. "Maybe I should." For the first time in a long while, Brendan felt like he wasn't just existing, he was present, and it had everything to do with the woman sitting across from him. The warmth of Ophelia's home lingered in Brendan's mind long after the meal was over. He found himself unexpectedly drawn to the easy comfort of her presence, the way she moved through her space with quiet confidence, as if she had carved out a corner of the world that belonged solely to her. It was a stark contrast to the relentless pace of his own life, where every moment was accounted for, every decision a calculation. After dinner, she stood and stretched, her fingers brushing against the back of her neck. "I'll grab some blankets for the couch," she said, disappearing down the hallway before he could protest. Brendan ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. He wasn't used to being taken care of, even in small ways. It was always him who handled things, who made decisions, who ensured everything ran smoothly. And yet, Ophelia had welcomed him in without hesitation, offering kindness without expecting anything in return. She returned a moment later, carrying a neatly folded blanket and a pillow. "It's not a luxury hotel, but it should do for the night." He accepted them with a nod of gratitude. "It's more than enough." She hesitated for a brief moment, as if debating whether to say something else, then simply gave him a small nod before heading toward her bedroom. "Good night, Brendan." He watched as her door clicked shut, leaving him alone in the soft glow of the living room lamp. Lying down, he stared at the ceiling, his mind refusing to slow. He had come to this town to escape, to find a moment of quiet, but he hadn't expected to meet someone like Ophelia. There was no pretense with her, no expectation of who he should be. For the first time in years, he wasn't a man defined by his success or his wealth. He was just Brendan, and oddly enough, he liked it. The next morning, the scent of coffee pulled him from sleep. He sat up, stretching out the stiffness in his back before following the aroma to the kitchen. Ophelia stood by the counter, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. She glanced over her shoulder. "Morning, hope you slept all right." "Better than I expected," he admitted, taking the offered cup. She leaned against the counter, sipping her own coffee. "I called the Airbnb host this morning. They're sending someone to reset the keypad later today." Brendan nodded, adjusting his grip on the warm ceramic mug. He should have felt relief, knowing he'd soon have access to his rental. But instead, there was a strange reluctance settling in his chest. "You don't have to rush out," she added, almost as if she had sensed his hesitation. "It's a slow morning at the bookstore. I could use the company." A beat of silence passed before he answered. "I'd like that." Her lips curved slightly, and without another word, she grabbed her coat, motioning for him to follow. The bookstore was tucked between two brick buildings, its large windows inviting in the soft morning light. Inside, the scent of aged paper and wood polish filled the air, shelves lined with books stretching from floor to ceiling. A small reading nook sat in one corner, complete with a worn leather chair and a steaming cup, likely from a customer who had stepped away. Ophelia moved through the space with an ease that told Brendan this wasn't just a store to her, it was home. She set her bag down behind the counter and glanced at him. "Ever worked in a bookstore before?" He let out a quiet laugh. "Can't say I have." "Well, consider this your first day," she said, handing him a book. "You can start by shelving this." Brendan eyed the novel in his hands before glancing up at her. "You're really putting me to work," she shrugged, a playful glint in her eyes. "You did eat my cooking last night. Seems like fair trade." He chuckled under his breath but didn't argue. Instead, he walked toward the shelves, scanning for the right place. As the morning stretched on, customers trickled in, and Brendan found himself observing Ophelia more than anything else. The way she spoke to each person with familiarity, the way she recommended books as if she knew exactly what they needed. There was a quiet magic to it, the way she connected with people effortlessly. At one point, a woman approached the counter, holding a book with a hopeful expression. "Ophelia, do you think I'd like this?" Ophelia barely had to glance at the cover before nodding. "You'll love it. The writing is lyrical, and the characters are exactly the kind that will stay with you long after you finish." The woman beamed. "Then I'll take it." Brendan watched as Ophelia rang up the sale, her expression one of genuine happiness. She wasn't just selling books, she was sharing something she loved. When the store quieted again, Ophelia turned to find Brendan leaning against one of the shelves, arms crossed. "You're good at this," he said simply. She tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. At what? At making people feel seen. Something in her expression shifted, a softness settling there. "Books do most of the work," she said lightly. He shook his head. "No, it's you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ophelia glanced away, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You're full of surprises, Brendan." He wasn't sure what it was about her, but he found himself wanting to know more to understand the quiet strength she carried, the way she had built a life that was so different from his own, yet seemed infinitely richer in ways that mattered. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about his next business deal or the demands of his company. He was thinking about her. The late afternoon sun cast golden light through the bookstore's large windows, highlighting the dust motes swirling lazily in the air. Brendan leaned against the counter, watching as Ophelia tucked a receipt into a customer's book with an easy smile. The small bell over the door chimed as the woman left, and for the first time since the morning rush, the store fell into a comfortable hush. He had spent the entire day here, something he hadn't planned, but the thought of leaving, of returning to an empty rental, felt strangely unappealing. He wasn't used to stillness, to spending hours without an agenda, yet standing here, in the quiet hum of Ophelia's world, felt more fulfilling than any deal he had ever closed. She turned toward him, brushing a stray curl from her face. "You've officially survived your first day in retail." Brendan exhaled a short laugh. "I don't know how you do it." Some of those customers had very strong opinions about shelving systems. Her lips twitched as she leaned against the counter beside him. "Book lovers are a passionate bunch." He glanced down at her, taking in the way the fading sunlight caught in her hair, the way she radiated a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with wealth or power. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, completely unpretentious, deeply rooted in a life she had built with her own hands, and he had never wanted to kiss someone more. The realization hit him with a force that left him momentarily breathless. He had spent years moving through relationships that were convenient, transactional in one way or another. But this pull toward Ophelia was something entirely different. She must have noticed the shift in his expression because her own softened, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. Before he could overthink it, Brendan reached out, his fingers brushing lightly over hers where they rested on the counter. "Come to dinner with me," he said, his voice lower than he intended. Her eyes searched his, hesitation flickering for the briefest moment before she exhaled. "Brendan, not as a favor," he interrupted, sensing the protest forming on her lips. "Not because I need a place to stay, just because I want to spend more time with you." A beat of silence stretched between them before she finally nodded. "All right," she murmured. Something unspoken settled between them, a promise of something neither of them had expected. The restaurant was small, tucked away on a quiet street, its atmosphere intimate but unpretentious. Brendan had chosen it on instinct, knowing instinctively that Ophelia wouldn't be impressed by extravagance. They sat across from each other in a corner booth, the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows over her face. She looked different outside of the bookstore, more undone, her usual confidence tinged with something quieter, more contemplative. "I don't usually do this," she admitted after the waiter had taken their orders. He arched a brow. "Dinner?" She huffed a quiet laugh. "No." "Letting people in this quickly." Brendan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "I don't either." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe him. "You seem like someone who's always surrounded by people." "I am," he conceded. "But that doesn't mean I let them in." Her fingers traced the rim of her glass absently. "Why?" He hesitated, caught off guard by how much he wanted to answer honestly. "Because in my world, people usually want something." She nodded as if she understood, and maybe she did. Brendan exhaled, shifting the conversation. "What about you?" "Why don't you let people in?" Ophelia hesitated before answering. "Because it's easier not to." He didn't push, didn't ask for more than she was ready to give. Instead, he simply held her gaze, letting the weight of the moment settle between them. The rest of the evening passed in an effortless rhythm, conversation flowing between them with a familiarity that felt impossible given how little time they had known each other. They talked about everything and nothing: favorite books, childhood memories, the quiet joys of small-town life versus the ceaseless energy of the city. By the time they left, the sky had darkened, the air crisp with the promise of night. Brendan walked beside her down the quiet street, hands tucked into his pockets. "I don't want this to end when I leave town," he admitted. She glanced up at him, something unreadable in her gaze. "And what exactly is this?" He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "Something I don't want to walk away from." For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then, finally, she stepped closer, tilting her head up to meet his gaze. "Then don't," she whispered. And just like that, Brendan knew he wasn't going anywhere. The night air was crisp as Brendan walked Ophelia back to her place, their footsteps echoing along the quiet street. A soft breeze stirred the leaves on the pavement, and the scent of salt from the distant ocean carried through the air. The town had settled into stillness, its charm amplified by the glow of streetlights casting golden halos over the cobblestones. Neither of them spoke for a moment, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged with something unspoken, something neither of them had dared to name yet. When they reached her door, Ophelia hesitated, her fingers brushing against the edge of her coat. Brendan watched her, noting the way she seemed to weigh her thoughts before finally looking up at him. "I don't usually do this," she admitted, her voice quieter now. He tilted his head slightly, curiosity flickering in his gaze. "Do what?" she exhaled, shaking her head as if amused by her own hesitation. "Let people into my world this quickly." Brendan leaned against the doorframe, studying her. "Maybe that's because no one else was worth letting in." Her lips parted slightly, surprise flashing across her face before she let out a small, breathy laugh. "You say things that make it very hard to keep my guard up." He allowed himself a small smile. "Good." Ophelia shifted, unlocking the door but not stepping inside just yet. "You're leaving soon," she said, though it wasn't a question, it was a fact she seemed to be testing out loud. Brendan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. I was. She arched a brow. Was? He let his fingers trail along the edge of the doorframe, his voice steady. I don't want this to just be a fleeting moment, Ophelia. And I don't think you do either. She looked at him, the guarded edge in her eyes warring with the undeniable truth between them. You don't belong here, Brendan. His jaw tensed slightly. And you don't belong in my world, right? She didn't answer. Brendan shifted, stepping closer. Maybe that's the point. Maybe we don't fit into each other's worlds because we're meant to build one of our own. Ophelia let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the edge of the door. That's a beautiful sentiment, she murmured, but real life isn't that simple. Brendan held her gaze, unwavering. No, it's not. But that doesn't mean it isn't worth trying. She studied him for a long moment before finally stepping back into her home. But before she could close the door, she paused, her voice barely above a whisper. Good night, Brendan. There was no finality in her tone, no goodbye, just a promise that this wasn't over. As she shut the door softly, Brendan stood there for a moment longer, his pulse steady but his mind racing. He had come to this town for a break. Instead, he had found something he wasn't willing to walk away from. Brendan sat in his car, the engine idling softly as he stared at the glowing windows of Ophelia's home. The night air was thick with something unspoken, a pull that hadn't lessened even after she had closed the door. He hadn't driven away yet because for the first time in years, he wasn't ready to leave. His world had always been one of movement, meetings, deadlines, acquisitions. He made decisions within seconds, cut through negotiations with precision, and never hesitated when it came to making a move. Yet here he was, sitting in a quiet coastal town, hesitating. Because Ophelia wasn't a deal to close. She wasn't a fleeting distraction or a temporary escape, and that terrified him. The next morning, he found himself walking back to her bookstore before he could talk himself out of it. The door chimed as he stepped inside, and Ophelia looked up from where she was stacking books on a wooden display. Her expression flickered with surprise, but not displeasure. Didn't expect to see you this early, she said, brushing a stray curl behind her ear. Brendan leaned against the counter, watching her. I figured I owed you at least one more day of free labor. She let out a quiet breath of laughter, shaking her head as she placed the last book in its spot. Most people would have taken their escape when they had the chance. I'm not most people, he said simply. Her eyes searched his, something guarded still lingering there but softer than before. No, you're not. They worked side by side again, the rhythm of the day unfolding in easy conversation and shared glances that neither of them acknowledged outright. It was different now, though. The awareness between them was no longer a question, it was an answer waiting for them to acknowledge it. At one point, Ophelia stepped onto a wooden stool to reach a high shelf, and Brendan instinctively placed a steadying hand on her waist. She stiffened slightly at the contact, but she didn't pull away. Instead, when she stepped back down, she stayed close enough that he could still feel her warmth. Brendan, she murmured, her fingers brushing the edge of a hardcover book on the counter. He knew what she was going to say, that he would leave eventually, that their lives were too different. That this wasn't meant to last, and he was done letting her believe that. I'm not going anywhere, he said, his voice steady. Her brows drew together slightly. You have an entire life somewhere else. I have a company, a career I built from nothing. But none of that means anything if I'm constantly running toward the next thing and never stopping to see what actually matters. She exhaled, her fingers tightening around the book she was holding. And you think this, she gestured between them, her voice quieter now, matters. Brendan reached for her hand, his fingers closing around hers with deliberate certainty. I know it does. For the first time, she didn't argue. That night, he took her to the edge of the coastal cliffs where the waves crashed against the rocks far below. The wind tugged at her hair, and she folded her arms against the cool air, though she didn't step away when Brendan moved closer. I never expected you, she admitted, her voice barely above the sound of the ocean. He reached for her hand again, intertwining their fingers. Neither did I. She turned to face him fully, her eyes searching his as if trying to find the flaw in all of this, the reason it couldn't be real. But Brendan had never been more certain of anything in his life. I don't want to be another person who walks away from you, Ophelia. His voice was quiet but firm. And I don't want you to be another person I regret letting go. She let out a shaky breath, and then, finally, she closed the distance between them. It wasn't a hesitant kiss. It wasn't filled with uncertainty or doubt. It was the kind of kiss that rewrote everything, that made the past irrelevant and the future something that could be rewritten entirely. When they finally pulled apart, Brendan rested his forehead against hers, his breath mingling with hers in the cool night air. "Stay," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of everything she had been afraid to say before. And Brendan knew, without a doubt, that he would.